I need a life that is moving forward.
Then let's finish this. Why is he on that stage?
That's my ex-husband.
Andrew Jackson was 42 years old and worked as an operations manager for a mid-sized construction company in Dallas, Texas. To everyone who knew him, he was the definition of ordinary. His neighbors believed he lacked ambition. His co-workers assumed he would retire in the same modest office, where he quietly packed the same homemade lunch every day, wearing the same old Casio watch and driving the same aging Ford Escape. What nobody knew was that some of America's largest real estate deals stopped moving whenever Andrew chose not to sign. The divorce papers slid across the polished oak table. Andrew rested his fingertips on the folder, opened it without a word, and froze for the briefest second as Mila's signature stared back at him in fresh blue ink. If you're watching from somewhere around the world, let me know your country and your local time in the comments. I'd love to see where everyone is joining from. And if you enjoy slow-burning stories where patience, truth, and quiet strength win in the end, consider subscribing so you won't miss tomorrow's story. The offices of Lawson and Pierce overlooked downtown Dallas from the 19th floor. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the late afternoon sun reflected off the glass towers surrounding Ross Avenue. Inside Conference Room B, the temperature was cool enough to make the polished walnut table feel cold beneath Andrew Jackson's folded hands. Rebecca Lawson sat quietly at one end of the table, a legal pad resting beside a thick stack of divorce documents. At 47, she had spent more than 2 decades handling corporate litigation before expanding into family law for select clients. Experience had taught her to recognize anger, desperation, regret, and fear within seconds of entering a room. Andrew displayed none of them. He sat with his shoulders relaxed, his old navy blazer hanging neatly over the back of the chair. His faded leather portfolio rested beside him. The Casio watch on his wrist showed 3:17 p.m. Across from him, Mila Jackson never looked directly into his eyes. Instead, she stared toward the skyline as though the city itself had become more interesting than the man she had spent 14 years married to. Rebecca broke the silence. Mr. and Mrs. Jackson, these documents reflect the final agreement submitted by both parties. Mila nodded almost immediately. Yes. Andrew simply answered, I've read them. Rebecca continued, the marital residence will be transferred to Mrs. Jackson. Mr. Jackson has agreed to waive any claim. Another nod from Mila. The retirement accounts remain separate. Correct. The savings account will be divided according to the attached schedule. Andrew answered before Mila could. That's fine. Rebecca paused. Most divorces slowed down here. Someone usually argued. Someone changed their mind. Someone asked for another week. Neither of them did. Andrew's calmness unsettled even the attorney. She looked toward him. Mr. Jackson, are you certain you've reviewed every provision? He met her eyes. I have. You understand you're entitled to negotiate? I understand. Rebecca waited. Nothing came. The silence stretched across the room until she finally continued. Outside, a siren echoed several blocks away. Inside, only the quiet hum of the air conditioner interrupted the stillness. Andrew noticed something most people would have ignored. Mila's phone lit up. She didn't pick it up. She simply flipped it face down. 20 seconds later, it vibrated again. She ignored it again. Then again. 3 notifications in less than 2 minutes. Andrew didn't need to read the screen. He had noticed the pattern months ago. Late-night meetings that lasted longer than necessary. Weekend conferences that somehow never produced presentation materials. New perfume she had never worn before. Expensive handbags appearing without receipts. Restaurant reservations she claimed were client dinners. None of those moments had proven anything. Together they painted a picture. He remembered standing alone in their kitchen one evening, nearly 5 months earlier. Mila had texted, running late, marketing emergency. 40 minutes later, Michael Turner had called. "I just saw Mila at the Crescent Club." Andrew had thanked him. Nothing more. He had never driven there, never confronted her, never searched her phone, never hired a private investigator. He simply watched. Patterns always revealed more than accusations. Rebecca slid another document across the table. The final acknowledgement. Mila signed first. Her signature moved quickly across the page, almost practiced. Andrew looked at the blue ink for only a second before signing beneath it. His handwriting remained steady. Not a single letter shook. Rebecca watched carefully. She had represented enough executives to recognize controlled emotion. This felt different. Andrew wasn't controlling himself. He simply wasn't surprised. That realization lingered in Rebecca's mind. Most men walked into this room hoping to save something. Andrew had entered, looking as though he had already accepted the ending. Mila finally spoke. "I think this is for the best." Andrew looked at her. His expression remained unchanged. "If that's what you believe." She frowned slightly. No argument, no pleading, no anger, not even disappointment. She had rehearsed this conversation in her head for weeks, perhaps months. She had expected questions. She had expected guilt, maybe even tears. Instead, she received calm acknowledgement. It somehow felt colder. "You don't have anything else to say?" she asked. Andrew thought for a moment, then answered quietly. "I hope you find what you're looking for." She blinked. That wasn't the response she expected either. Rebecca glanced between them. There was something unfinished beneath the surface. Not unfinished legally, emotionally. Mila gathered her purse. "I've already made arrangements to move the rest of my things tomorrow." Andrew nodded once. "The garage code still works." She waited. Again. Nothing else. No request to stay. No mention of memories. No discussion about 14 years together. Only practical information. She stood. "So, goodbye." Andrew stood as well. "Take care of yourself." For the first time all afternoon, Mila actually looked directly at him. His face was unreadable. Not empty, not cold. Simply settled. It irritated her more than she expected. She turned and walked toward the door. The sound of her heels echoed through the hallway until it disappeared behind the closing elevator doors. Rebecca slowly gathered the paperwork. "I've handled hundreds of divorces." Andrew looked at her. She continued. "This is the first one where I can't tell whether the husband lost everything or already knew something nobody else did." A faint smile almost appeared on Andrew's face. "Almost?" "I appreciate everything you've done." Rebecca hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" "You can." "Why didn't you fight harder?" Andrew closed his leather portfolio. "You can't convince someone to stay after they've already left." Rebecca considered that answer. It sounded simple. Too simple. Yet something about the way he said it suggested a deeper meaning. As Andrew walked toward the elevator, Rebecca watched through the glass wall until the doors closed behind him. She looked back at the signed documents, then at the empty chair where Mila had been sitting. Her instincts, sharpened over 25 years of law, whispered that this story was far from over. Outside downtown Dallas buzzed with late-afternoon traffic. Andrew crossed the parking garage without rushing. His aging Ford Escape sat exactly where he had parked it that morning. The silver paint had begun to fade along the roof. A small scrape marked the rear bumper. He unlocked the door, placed his portfolio on the passenger seat, and started the engine. The radio remained off. For nearly a minute, he simply watched the city through the windshield. His breathing stayed slow, measured. Not because he felt nothing, because he had already processed the pain long before today. The divorce had become official. The marriage had ended months earlier. He reached into the center console and picked up a second phone. Unlike the one he carried every day, this device contained only a handful of contacts. He pressed one name. The call connected before the second ring. A calm male voice answered. Yes. Andrew looked once more toward the Dallas skyline. His voice remained quiet. Proceed with Phase 4. There was no surprise on the other end, only a brief pause. Understood. The line disconnected. Andrew placed the phone back into the console, shifted the Ford into drive, and pulled out of the parking garage as the evening traffic swallowed the old SUV, leaving behind nothing that suggested the quiet man inside had just set something far bigger into motion. Andrew Jackson left downtown Dallas before the evening rush reached its worst. His old Ford Escape blended into the stream of commuters heading north on Interstate 35E, surrounded by luxury SUVs, electric sedans, and gleaming pickup trucks that cost more than his entire vehicle. He never paid attention to what other people drove. The Ford had crossed 193,000 miles the previous month. It still started every morning. That was enough. 25 minutes later, he pulled into the driveway of a quiet brick house in Richardson. Nothing about the neighborhood attracted attention. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks. Sprinklers watered neatly trimmed lawns. A retired couple waved while walking their Labrador. Andrew waved back exactly as he had for years. To everyone living on the street, he was simply the polite man whose wife had recently moved out. No one imagined that before sunrise the next morning he would join a video conference involving executives from 3 states, 2 investment funds, and attorneys billing over $1,000 an hour. That was exactly how Andrew preferred it. Inside the house, silence had replaced the routine sounds of married life. Half the bookshelves were empty. The guest bedroom contained stacked moving boxes left behind after Mila had packed most of her belongings. Her coffee mug no longer sat beside the sink. The framed vacation photographs from Colorado had disappeared from the hallway. Andrew noticed every absence. He simply refused to chase what had already chosen to leave. He loosened his tie, placed his keys on the kitchen counter, and opened the refrigerator. Chicken, rice, steamed vegetables, the same meal he prepared nearly every Sunday evening for the coming week. He heated one container in the microwave while reading several emails on his tablet. None of them came from his construction company. Instead, encrypted messages waited inside a secured application protected by multiple authentication layers. Project Falcon, Project Ridge, Project Summit. Each carried only reference numbers instead of company names. The details were invisible to anyone without clearance. Even if Mila had looked over his shoulder during the past 5 years, she would have seen almost nothing she could understand. That had never been an accident. The confidentiality agreements governing Andrew's consulting work prohibited him from discussing clients' negotiations, purchase strategies, or acquisition timelines with anyone outside the approved legal teams. Breaking one agreement could cost millions. Breaking several could destroy years of trust. He had signed the first NDA almost 11 years earlier. He still remembered the conversation. A regional manufacturing company had quietly searched for nearly 600 acres outside Fort Worth. Buying the land directly would have driven prices through the roof. Andrew had proposed acquiring dozens of smaller parcels through separate holding companies before consolidating them. The client saved nearly $80 million. Afterward, they recommended him to another investment group, then another. Eventually, referrals replaced advertising. His reputation spread through boardrooms rather than newspapers. People who needed him always seemed to find him. People outside that circle rarely knew he existed. His phone vibrated. Michael Turner. Andrew answered. You made it home. I did. How'd it go? It ended. A brief silence followed. Michael sighed. I was hoping she'd change her mind. Andrew looked toward the backyard through the kitchen window. The sun had nearly disappeared. So was I. Michael understood the difference. Andrew had hoped. He had never expected. I'll stop by, Michael said. Bring coffee. Already on my way. 30 minutes later, a dark blue Honda Accord pulled into the driveway. Michael carried 2 paper cups from a nearby cafe. The two men had met during graduate school nearly 20 years earlier. Michael had become a certified public accountant specializing in corporate tax strategy. Andrew specialized in land acquisitions. Together, they had quietly solved problems for some remarkably large clients. Neither enjoyed publicity. Michael entered without knocking. "You eating?" Andrew pointed toward the kitchen. "There's another container." Michael laughed. "You really eat the same thing every week." "It works." "So does owning more than one recipe." Andrew smiled faintly. The conversation stayed light for several minutes. Then Michael leaned against the counter. "You going to tell me how you're really doing?" Andrew took a slow sip of coffee. "I've had months to prepare." "I know. Today's paperwork just made it official." Michael nodded. He had watched the marriage deteriorate longer than anyone else, not because Andrew complained, because he quietly observed. He remembered one evening almost 2 years earlier. The three of them had planned dinner together. Mila canceled an hour beforehand. Client meeting. Andrew never questioned it. Instead, he cooked enough for 3 anyway. Michael still remembered watching Andrew wrap untouched food into containers without saying a single negative word. Another memory surfaced. Christmas. Andrew bought Mila the camera she had wanted for nearly a year. She thanked him politely, then spent most of Christmas afternoon texting someone else. Andrew noticed. He said nothing. Not because he was weak, because he believed trust should exist without surveillance. Michael finally asked the question he had carried for months. "Did you ever think about telling her?" Andrew looked at him. "Telling her what?" "The consulting. The companies. The projects. The money." Andrew answered almost immediately. "I wanted to." "So why didn't you?" "Because every time I tried, she stopped listening before I finished." Michael remained quiet. Andrew continued. "The first time I received a major consulting contract, I couldn't explain where the income came from." "NDA," Andrew nodded. "She asked why I kept traveling. I couldn't answer." "She asked why unknown numbers called late at night. I couldn't answer." "She asked why I occasionally met lawyers instead of co-workers. I couldn't answer." Michael understood. Corporate confidentiality often looked suspicious from the outside, especially inside a marriage already beginning to fracture. Andrew looked down at the untouched half of his dinner. "I kept thinking." He stopped. Michael waited. "I kept thinking once the current project's finished, I'd finally be able to explain everything." But another project came. And another. And another. Andrew nodded. The work became bigger. The contracts became stricter. The timelines overlapped. Michael folded his arms, and she started believing something else. Andrew didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence filled the room. Finally, Michael spoke. "Victor Sterling." Andrew looked toward him. "You know?" "I know enough." Michael frowned. "How long?" Andrew thought carefully. "I noticed the pattern about 6 months ago." "You never hired anyone?" "No." "You never followed her?" "No." "You never confronted Victor?" "No." Michael shook his head in disbelief. "I don't know anyone with your level of patience." Andrew answered quietly. "Patience isn't the same as ignorance." Another silence settled between them. Michael placed his coffee cup on the counter. "So," he lowered his voice. "Phase 4. Andrew finally allowed himself the smallest smile. "It's moving. Charles approved. This morning. And the board. They're waiting." Michael leaned back and let out a slow whistle. "If everything closes?" "It will. This becomes the largest acquisition you've ever supervised." Andrew nodded once. Michael laughed softly. "And Mila thinks she just divorced an operations manager." Andrew didn't laugh. He simply looked toward the darkening sky beyond the kitchen window. "I never wanted her to admire me because of money." Michael studied his friend's face. "What did you want?" Andrew answered without hesitation. "I wanted her to trust me before she understood me." Outside, a light rain began tapping gently against the windows. Andrew stood and carried the empty dinner container to the sink. His phone vibrated once. One encrypted notification. Project Falcon executive signing ceremony confirmed. The Adolphus Hotel, Dallas. 3 days. Attendance mandatory. Andrew locked the screen before setting the phone face down. Michael noticed the date. 3 days. Exactly 3 days after the divorce became official. Neither man spoke. Neither needed to. Some moments carried enough weight without explanation. Andrew looked once more through the rain-speckled window. Somewhere else in Dallas, Mila was almost certainly beginning a new chapter of her life. She believed she had walked away from an ordinary man. She had no idea that in just 72 hours she would hear Andrew's name spoken repeatedly inside a ballroom filled with executives, investors, and reporters. And for the first time in 14 years, she would realize how little she had ever known about the quiet man she had left behind. The first time Andrew Jackson saw Victor Sterling in person, the man arrived 15 minutes late to a charity gala at the Windspear Opera House. Andrew had not attended because he enjoyed social events. Charles Whitmore had insisted. Some relationships are easier to maintain over dinner than inside a boardroom. Andrew reluctantly accepted. He wore the same navy suit he had owned for nearly 7 years. The tailor had adjusted it twice. It still fit perfectly. Most of the guests never noticed him. That was normal. Charles introduced him only to the handful of executives who actually needed to know his role. Everyone else simply assumed Andrew was another operations consultant, accompanying one of the investors. Victor's entrance changed the atmosphere. A black Rolls-Royce stopped outside the red carpet. Camera flashes erupted almost immediately. Several local business reporters hurried toward the entrance. Victor stepped out, smiling, wearing an expensive charcoal tuxedo that fit as though it had been designed exclusively for him. His confidence filled the room before he spoke a single word. Behind him walked 2 assistants. One carried his phone. The other carried a leather portfolio. Andrew watched from across the ballroom while speaking quietly with Charles. Victor shook hands with nearly everyone. He knew exactly where every camera stood. He paused at just the right angles. His smile never disappeared. It looked practiced. Charles noticed Andrew observing. "You know who he is." Andrew nodded. "Victor Sterling. He's been expanding aggressively." "I've read the filings." Charles smiled. "I figured you had." Victor eventually crossed the ballroom toward their table. A mutual acquaintance completed the introduction. "Victor, I'd like you to meet Charles Whitmore." The 2 businessmen exchanged firm handshakes. Then the host turned toward Andrew. "And this is Andrew Jackson." Victor extended his hand politely. "Pleasure." Andrew shook it once. "The same." Victor's attention drifted away almost immediately. His eyes briefly scanned Andrew's inexpensive watch before returning to Charles. The gesture lasted less than 2 seconds. Andrew noticed. He said nothing. Victor spent the next several minutes discussing market forecasts, commercial developments, and luxury residential projects. He spoke confidently, sometimes correctly, sometimes not. Andrew quietly listened. Victor mentioned a parcel near Arlington. Andrew already knew the environmental study had uncovered groundwater issues. Victor confidently predicted the land would double in value. Andrew remained silent. Victor praised a proposed logistics corridor outside Denton. Andrew had personally advised one of the investment groups to avoid it due to future transportation changes that had not yet become public. Again, he said nothing. Charles occasionally glanced toward Andrew. He understood why. Andrew possessed information that could instantly reshape half the conversations happening inside the ballroom. Yet he never volunteered it. Confidentiality wasn't simply part of his profession, it had become part of his personality. Later that evening, while guests gathered near the dessert tables, Andrew stepped onto the terrace overlooking downtown Dallas. The spring air felt cooler than inside the crowded ballroom. His phone vibrated. An encrypted message. Project Falcon. Environmental approval received. Proceeding to acquisition phase. He acknowledged the update before placing the phone back into his pocket. The terrace door opened behind him. Footsteps approached. Mila. She carried 2 champagne glasses. "I've been looking for you." Andrew accepted one. "Thank you." She leaned against the railing. "You've hardly talked to anyone tonight." "I've talked enough." She looked through the glass doors toward Victor, laughing with several developers. "Now that's someone who knows how to build connections." Andrew followed her gaze. Victor stood surrounded by people. Every conversation appeared energetic, every laugh slightly louder than necessary. "He certainly gets attention," Andrew replied. Mila smiled. "That's what successful people do." Andrew didn't answer. She continued, "You should learn from people like him." "What do you mean? You work just as hard." "But nobody notices. You've been with the same company for years. No promotions that anyone hears about. No interviews. No awards. No recognition." Andrew studied the skyline instead of replying immediately. Finally, he asked, "Does recognition matter that much?" She looked genuinely surprised. "Of course it does. If you're successful, people should know." Andrew turned the champagne glass slowly in his hand. "What if the work matters more than being known?" She laughed softly. "That's something people tell themselves when they never become successful." The words settled quietly between them. Andrew felt them, not because they insulted him, because they revealed something deeper. He realized Mila no longer measured success by character. She measured it by visibility. That difference could not be solved through explanation. Back inside, Victor stood near a display showing architectural renderings of future developments. He noticed Mila approaching. "So we finally meet." She smiled warmly. "I've followed your projects for years." "I'm flattered." The conversation flowed naturally. Victor spoke about expanding into mixed-use developments across Texas. Mila listened with genuine admiration. Andrew watched from across the room, not jealous, observant. Victor possessed an undeniable gift. He understood how to make people feel included, important, seen. He complimented effortlessly. He remembered names. He maintained eye contact. His confidence attracted attention the way bright lights attracted insects. Andrew understood why many people admired him. He also understood something else. Charm and competence often traveled together, but not always. As the evening ended, valet attendants brought vehicles to the front entrance. Luxury cars rolled forward one after another. Bentleys, Mercedes, Porsches. Victor's Rolls-Royce drew another cluster of cameras. Andrew waited patiently until the crowd dispersed. Then his old Ford Escape arrived. The parking attendant handed over the keys with the same respectful smile he gave every guest. Andrew thanked him. Victor happened to notice. For the first time all evening, a faint expression of amusement crossed his face. Not mocking, simply dismissive. The expression lasted only a moment. Andrew climbed into the Ford without reacting. Inside the passenger seat rested a sealed envelope. Confidential. Project Falcon. Charles had handed it to him before leaving. Andrew drove home without opening it. He preferred reviewing sensitive documents inside his office. Months passed. Victor's name appeared more frequently across Dallas business magazines, groundbreaking ceremonies, television interviews, awards, ribbon cuttings. His public image continued growing. Meanwhile, Andrew's daily routine remained almost unchanged. He left home before sunrise. He visited industrial sites wearing steel-toe boots instead of tailored suits. He spent hours reviewing surveys, environmental reports, zoning maps, and infrastructure studies. He met attorneys inside anonymous conference rooms rather than expensive restaurants. He negotiated quietly, signed carefully, disappeared before announcements reached the news. Mila noticed only the surface. She saw Victor's photographs in magazines. She saw Andrew cleaning leaves from the gutters on Saturday mornings. She saw Victor standing beside governors and investors. She saw Andrew replacing the brakes on his aging Ford himself. Gradually, comparison replaced appreciation. One evening, she placed a magazine on the kitchen counter. Victor Sterling occupied the cover beneath the headline, "The Man Reshaping Texas Real Estate." She looked toward Andrew. Imagine having a life like that. Andrew looked at the cover for several seconds, then returned to washing the dinner dishes. What part? The success. The influence. The opportunities. The respect. Andrew dried one plate before answering. Magazines don't usually print the whole story. She folded her arms. They print enough? Andrew nodded quietly. Perhaps they did. Or perhaps they only printed the part designed to sell copies. Several weeks later, Victor announced the largest commercial redevelopment proposal in his company's history. Business journals called it transformational. Financial analysts predicted it would redefine his career. Television stations requested interviews. The business community buzzed with speculation. Andrew noticed only one detail: the acquisition zone outlined on the presentation map. He recognized every parcel, every access road, every utility corridor, every easement. Project Falcon. He closed the presentation on his computer and looked toward the calendar hanging beside his desk. The executive signing ceremony had finally received a confirmed date, 3 days after his divorce. Andrew slowly leaned back in his chair. For the first time in months, two completely separate parts of his life were about to collide. Victor still believed he was approaching the greatest success of his career. Mila still believed she had left an ordinary husband for an extraordinary man. Neither of them yet understood that both paths were quietly leading toward the same ballroom, and toward one signature that neither of them controlled. 3 days after the divorce became official, the ballroom inside the Adolphus Hotel shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers that had overlooked Dallas business history for generations. By 8:30 that morning, hotel staff were arranging polished nameplates across the front table, while technicians tested the massive LED screen stretching nearly 40 feet across the stage. Executives from investment funds, commercial banks, engineering firms, and development companies filled the room in tailored suits and quiet conversations. The atmosphere felt different from an ordinary press conference. This was where fortunes became contracts. Andrew Jackson arrived through the hotel's underground parking garage instead of the main entrance. He carried the same worn leather portfolio, the same navy suit, the same inexpensive watch. The valet briefly glanced at the aging Ford Escape before handing Andrew a parking ticket. Nothing about him suggested he was one of the most important people attending the ceremony. Andrew preferred it that way. He entered through a private hallway reserved for speakers and principal advisors. A young event coordinator approached immediately. "Mr. Jackson?" "Yes." "We've prepared conference room cedar for you before the signing." "Thank you. The board members will join you at 10. Andrew nodded politely. "No media interviews?" The coordinator smiled. "As requested." Andrew walked towards the conference room without looking inside the ballroom. Meanwhile, another black vehicle stopped beneath the hotel's main entrance. This one attracted attention. A glossy black Bentley Flying Spur rolled onto the circular driveway. Photographers immediately gathered. Victor Sterling stepped out first. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit with a deep blue tie that matched his company colors. His smile appeared effortlessly confident. Behind him emerged Mila. She wore an elegant ivory dress beneath a fitted beige coat. Diamond earrings reflected the morning sunlight as cameras briefly turned toward her. Several reporters recognized Victor. One called out, "Mr. Sterling?" Victor paused exactly where the lighting looked best. "Good morning." "How confident are you about today's agreement?" Victor smiled. "Very." "Is this truly your biggest project?" "It certainly represents the most exciting opportunity our company has ever pursued." Another reporter asked, "What does today's acquisition mean for Dallas?" Victor answered smoothly, "It means thousands of jobs and billions in future investment." The cameras loved him. Mila stood quietly beside him, watching the flashes. Only 3 days earlier, she had finalized her divorce from Andrew. Today, she stood beside one of the city's most celebrated developers. Everything appeared to confirm she had made the correct decision. As they entered the ballroom, guests greeted Victor warmly. "Congratulations. Outstanding work. We've heard incredible things." Victor accepted each compliment naturally. He belonged in rooms like this, or so everyone believed. Mila noticed the attention. It felt intoxicating. She remembered Andrew attending business dinners where almost nobody recognized him. People rarely walked across rooms to greet Andrew. Nobody requested photographs. Nobody waited eagerly for his arrival. Standing beside Victor felt completely different. A hostess escorted them toward the reserved front tables. Each seat carried engraved name cards. Victor Sterling, Chief Executive Officer, Sterling Urban Development. Beside it, Mila Sterling, Guest. Mila smiled faintly. The new surname wasn't official, but seeing it printed there stirred something inside her. A future. Or at least the image of one. The ballroom slowly filled. Charles Whitmore entered quietly through another doorway. Unlike Victor, Charles attracted no cameras. Yet nearly every executive in the room acknowledged him. Some stood to shake his hand. Others simply nodded respectfully. Influence often arrived without applause. Charles greeted several investors before taking his seat. He checked his watch. 9:42. One board member leaned toward him. "Has Andrew arrived?" Charles answered calmly. "He's upstairs." "Good. We won't begin without him." Victor overheard only the last sentence. He assumed they were discussing another executive. The event coordinator stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining Granite Peak Capital and Sterling Urban Development for today's strategic acquisition announcement." The room gradually quieted. Large spotlights illuminated the stage. The enormous LED display remained black. The coordinator continued. "Before our principals take the stage, we'd like to recognize the organizations and advisors whose work made this transaction possible." Logos appeared one after another. Granite Peak Capital, First National Commercial Bank, Carter Infrastructure Group, Westfield Environmental Consulting, Hamilton Legal Advisors. Victor watched proudly. This was his moment. Months of negotiations, years of expansion, everything had led here. The coordinator smiled. "We'll now recognize several key strategic contributors." The first names appeared. Lead Financial Counsel, Environmental Review Director, Infrastructure Planning Team. Victor glanced only briefly. Routine acknowledgments. Then the slide changed. Large white letters appeared across a dark blue background. Strategic Land Acquisition, Consultant, Andrew Jackson. The room remained silent. Victor barely reacted. The name meant nothing to him. Beside him, however, Mila stopped breathing. For a moment, she wondered whether she had read it incorrectly. Andrew Jackson. Her eyes locked onto the screen. The letters didn't change. Her pulse accelerated. No, there had to be another Andrew Jackson. It was a common enough name. Surely it wasn't. The coordinator continued speaking. "Our appreciation also goes to Mr. Andrew Jackson, whose acquisition strategy coordinated more than 200 individual land transactions across 4 Texas counties." Mila slowly turned toward Victor. "Did you know?" Her voice barely emerged. An Andrew Jackson. Victor frowned. I don't think so. Charles Whitmore leaned toward another executive several seats away. When Andrew comes down, let him know we're ready. The executive nodded. Victor heard the conversation this time. His attention sharpened. He quietly asked the investor seated beside him, "Who's Andrew Jackson?" The older man looked surprised. "You don't know?" Victor smiled politely. "I've never met him." The investor blinked. "I assumed you had." "No." The man seemed genuinely confused. "That's unusual." "Why?" "Because this project doesn't exist without him." Victor's smile disappeared. "What do you mean?" Before the investor could answer, the coordinator announced a short intermission before the official signing. Guests rose from their seats. Coffee stations opened. Conversations resumed. Victor immediately crossed the ballroom toward Charles Whitmore. "Charles." Charles greeted him politely. "Victor, I wanted to ask you something." "Of course." "The presentation mentioned Andrew Jackson." "Yes." "Who exactly is he?" Charles looked genuinely surprised. "You've never met Andrew?" "No." Charles paused. For the first time that morning, a slight crease appeared across his forehead. "I assumed your legal team had introduced you." "They never mentioned him." Charles looked toward one of his assistants. "Where's Andrew now?" "Conference room Cedar." Charles nodded. Then he turned back toward Victor. "You'll meet him shortly." Victor smiled again. "Perfect." "What role does he play?" Charles answered matter-of-factly. "He assembled the acquisition?" Victor frowned. "My company assembled the acquisition?" Charles looked at him steadily. "No." A brief silence settled between them. "Your company developed the project?" "Andrew assembled the land." Victor stared. Charles continued calmly. $612 million worth of land. More than 200 separate property interests. Dozens of negotiations. Years of planning. Every parcel had to fit together perfectly. Victor's confidence wavered for the first time all morning. "I was told the acquisitions came through several independent brokers." "They did." Charles nodded. "They all reported to Andrew." Victor felt something tighten in his chest. That wasn't what his internal reports had shown. That wasn't what his executives had explained. Before he could ask another question, one of Granite Peak's attorneys approached Charles. "We're ready upstairs." Charles nodded once. "I'll bring Andrew down." He started walking toward the private elevators. Victor instinctively took one step after him. "Charles." Charles stopped. "Yes." Victor forced a relaxed smile. "I'd really like to meet Mr. Jackson before we begin." Charles answered without hesitation. "You will." Then he added one sentence that neither Victor nor Mila would forget. "After all, he's the only person in this building who can authorize the final transfer." Charles disappeared into the elevator. The doors closed. Victor remained standing in the middle of the ballroom. Beside him, Mila slowly looked back toward the enormous LED screen, where one name still remained displayed beneath the title Strategic Land Acquisition Consultant. Andrew Jackson. For the first time since leaving her marriage, uncertainty quietly replaced certainty. And upstairs, only one floor away, Andrew closed the final page inside his leather portfolio as someone knocked gently on the conference room door. "Mr. Jackson," the assistant said, "the board is waiting." Conference room Cedar occupied the quietest corner of the 20th floor. Unlike the ballroom below, there were no photographers, no reporters, no decorative banners, only a polished conference table, 12 leather chairs, and a wall of windows overlooking downtown Dallas. Andrew Jackson entered carrying nothing except his worn leather portfolio. 8 people were already waiting. Charles Whitmore stood first. "So good to see you," Andrew shook his hand. Morning, Charles. Around the table sat representatives from Granite Peak, Capital First National Commercial Bank Hamilton legal advisors, and 2 members of the investment committee responsible for approving the largest commercial acquisition in the firm's history. No introductions were necessary. Andrew had worked with every person in the room before, some for nearly a decade. Charles looked around the table. I believe we're all here. One of the attorneys smiled. Except the only person everyone downstairs is actually waiting for. A few people laughed quietly. Andrew simply took his seat. Charles opened the meeting. Before we move into the public ceremony, I'd like to review one final issue. He looked toward Andrew. Status. Andrew opened the portfolio. Inside rested several color-coded folders arranged with military precision. No unnecessary papers, no loose notes. Every page had its place. He slid the first document toward the center. Parcel acquisition. Completed. The second. Environmental compliance. Completed. The third. Utility easements. Recorded. The fourth. County approvals. Filed yesterday. The fifth. Title insurance. Verified. No dramatic presentation. No lengthy speech, just facts. One board member leaned forward. Any unresolved claims? Andrew answered immediately. 2. The room became attentive. They're expected? Yes. The first involves a utility correction already covered under Section 9. The second concerns a historical access road. Charles nodded. Already negotiated. Andrew confirmed. The settlement agreement becomes effective immediately after execution. Another director smiled. So nothing that threatens closing. No. The room relaxed. Charles looked around. Ladies and gentlemen, this is why we keep asking Andrew to lead these projects. One investor chuckled. I've never seen him arrive with surprises. Andrew quietly closed the folder. I don't like surprises. The room laughed again. Charles understood the deeper meaning. Neither did Andrew. Especially not when hundreds of millions of dollars depended on precision. One banker asked, how many properties in total? Andrew answered without checking his notes. 212. And negotiations? 341. Separate sellers? 187. The banker shook his head slowly. Most acquisition teams would require 30 people. Andrew replied, I had 32. The room smiled. Everyone knew what he meant. 32 specialized attorneys. Surveyors, title officers, engineers, and negotiators spread across Texas. Andrew coordinated them. He never tried doing everything himself. He simply made certain everyone moved in the same direction. Charles leaned back. Tell them the timeline. Andrew looked toward the projection screen. The first parcel entered negotiation 28 months ago. A soft whistle escaped from one director. Nearly 2.5 years. Andrew nodded. The final parcel closed last Thursday. Another executive asked, Did Sterling Development know? No. They knew properties were being acquired. They didn't know the acquisition structure. Charles smiled. Exactly as intended. One younger board member looked genuinely curious. I've always wondered something. Andrew waited. How did you convince hundreds of owners to sell without anyone realizing the land would eventually become one project? Andrew answered in the same calm voice. Because they weren't selling to one company. They sold to local holding firms, family investment groups, regional partnerships. Every negotiation remained independent. No owner believed they were part of a larger assembly. The young director slowly nodded. That's brilliant. Andrew gently corrected him. It's patient. There was a difference. Brilliance impressed people. Patience built outcomes. Charles checked his watch. 15 minutes. The public ceremony approached. One attorney distributed the signature packets. Each binder contained hundreds of pages. Most executives would sign only 2 or 3 documents. Andrew's binder required 19 separate signatures. One board member noticed. "You always get the thickest folder." Andrew smiled faintly. "I usually create it." Everyone laughed again. The atmosphere remained relaxed. Professional, confident. No one questioned whether today's transaction would succeed. Not anymore. The difficult work had already been finished. Downstairs, however, uncertainty continued spreading. Victor Sterling stood beside one of his senior vice presidents near the coffee station. "Why wasn't I told about Andrew Jackson?" The executive frowned. "I don't know who that is." "Find out." "I'm trying." Within minutes, 2 assistants searched through digital project files, emails, meeting records, vendor lists. Nothing obvious appeared. Finally, one assistant located dozens of references. AJ Consulting, AJ Holdings, AJ Strategic, AJ Land Services. No full name, only initials. The assistant hurried back. "We found something." Victor took the tablet. His eyes narrowed. Every major acquisition over the previous 2 years included one common signature. A. Jackson. He frowned. Why was this never explained? The vice president answered carefully. "We assumed AJ represented a consulting group." Victor continued reading. Every critical approval, every coordinated closing, every final transfer. A. Jackson. He looked up. "How much were they paid?" The assistant hesitated. "The consulting fees." "Yes." "Are protected under separate confidentiality agreements." Victor frowned again. "What does that mean?" "It means we don't have access." "Not even internally?" "No." Victor had never encountered that before. He owned the development company, yet portions of the transaction remained inaccessible. Someone else had negotiated those terms, someone with considerably more authority than he realized. Across the ballroom, Mila quietly stared toward the elevators. Andrew's name continued echoing inside her thoughts. Andrew Jackson, Strategic Land Acquisition Consultant. The title felt unfamiliar. Not because she had never heard those words, because Andrew had never described himself that way. She remembered asking countless times, "What exactly do you do?" His answer rarely changed. "I coordinate projects." She had interpreted that as ordinary middle management. Now uncertainty began rearranging old memories. Late-night conference calls, unexpected business trips, meetings with attorneys, encrypted emails, confidential documents. She had once accused him of hiding things. He had calmly answered, "I can't discuss client work." At the time, she believed it was an excuse. Now, she wasn't so certain. Another memory surfaced. Nearly 3 years earlier, Andrew had canceled a vacation to Colorado. She had been furious. "You always choose work." He had apologized. "I have to finish something important." She later learned Victor Sterling had announced a major commercial acquisition that same month. She assumed Andrew's company had simply worked overtime. Now she wondered, had Andrew actually been working on Victor's project without Victor even knowing? Her thoughts were interrupted by movement near the elevators. Several Granite Peak executives entered the ballroom. Charles Whitmore walked in front. Behind him came attorneys carrying signature binders. Everyone stood. Victor adjusted his jacket. This was finally beginning. But Andrew was not with them. Victor quietly asked Charles, "Where's Mr. Jackson?" Charles answered simply, "He'll join us after one final verification." Victor forced another smile. "I'd really appreciate an introduction." Charles looked directly at him. "I imagine you will." The answer sounded strangely deliberate. At the rear of the ballroom hotel, staff quietly opened a second set of doors leading directly to the stage. Only principal signatories were permitted through that entrance. A production manager checked his headset. "We're ready?" Another coordinator answered, "Waiting on Mr. Jackson." Those words reached Mila's ears. Waiting on Andrew. Not waiting for Victor, not waiting for the investors, waiting for Andrew. Her heartbeat quickened again. For 14 years she had believed she understood exactly who her husband was. In less than 30 minutes, that certainty had begun to unravel. Upstairs, Andrew carefully placed his fountain pen inside the inner pocket of his jacket. He closed the final folder. Charles approached him. "They're ready." Andrew stood. "Let's finish it." Together, they walked toward the private elevator. As the doors closed behind them, neither man spoke. The elevator descended slowly toward the ballroom below, toward hundreds of waiting guests, toward Victor Sterling, toward Mila, and toward a truth that could no longer remain hidden once the elevator doors opened. The ballroom lights dimmed precisely at 10 o'clock. A low instrumental score drifted through hidden speakers as conversations faded into silence. Nearly 400 guests turned toward the stage. The massive LED screen displayed a single title: Granite Peak, Capital Strategic Acquisition Announcement. A spotlight followed the Master of Ceremonies as she walked to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this morning." She welcomed representatives from investment firms, commercial banks, engineering partners, legal advisors, and city officials before inviting Charles Whitmore onto the stage. Applause filled the room. Charles accepted it politely before stepping behind the podium. He never spoke loudly. He never needed to. His reputation carried more weight than volume. "Thank you all for being here." He looked slowly across the audience. "This transaction has taken more than 2 years to complete." He paused. "Not because it was difficult. Because it had to be done correctly." Several executives nodded. Charles continued, "In business, people often celebrate the closing. They rarely appreciate the preparation." The words immediately caught Andrew's attention backstage. Preparation. That had always been his philosophy. Charles smiled faintly. "Today you'll see signatures. What you won't see are thousands of hours spent solving problems before they ever reached this room." More applause followed. Victor sat confidently in the front row. Everything still appeared under control. Andrew had been acknowledged. Nothing more. Surely the consultant would simply sign several documents and leave. That assumption still felt reasonable. Charles gestured toward the enormous screen. "The Falcon Development District will become one of the largest mixed-use commercial projects in Texas." Architectural renderings appeared. Glass office towers, luxury apartments, hotels, retail districts, public parks, transportation corridors. The audience admired the images. Several reporters hurried to capture photographs. Charles continued, "The project's value exceeds $612 million. A murmur spread through the ballroom. Even experienced investors appreciated the scale. Charles clicked the presentation remote again. A map filled the screen. Hundreds of differently colored parcels formed one continuous development zone. What you're seeing wasn't purchased from one owner. It wasn't purchased from 10 owners. It required negotiations with 187 independent property holders. The audience remained silent. Charles smiled. That level of coordination deserves recognition. He turned toward the side entrance beside the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, for the first time today, I'd like to introduce the person who coordinated every acquisition." The ballroom lights shifted. A spotlight illuminated the entrance. The side door opened. Andrew Jackson walked onto the stage. No dramatic music, no theatrical entrance, simply steady footsteps. He carried the same worn leather portfolio, the same navy suit, the same inexpensive watch. The room applauded politely, then more warmly, then enthusiastically. Many executives stood. Several investment managers rose first, then attorneys, then banking representatives. Within seconds, nearly half the ballroom had risen to its feet. Victor remained seated. Not intentionally. He simply froze. Mila stared at the stage as though the room had tilted beneath her. Andrew acknowledged the applause with a small nod. Nothing more. No wave. No broad smile. He walked directly toward Charles. The two men shook hands. Charles spoke quietly enough that nearby microphones barely captured it. "Ready?" Andrew answered. "Always." Charles turned back toward the audience. "I've worked with Andrew Jackson for 11 years. He has never missed a closing. He has never lost a negotiated parcel. And to my knowledge," he smiled toward Andrew, "he has never once reminded anyone of those facts." Laughter spread through the ballroom. Andrew smiled politely. Charles continued, "People often ask me what makes a successful acquisition strategist. They expect me to mention finance, law, engineering, negotiation." He shook his head. "The answer is patience." He looked toward Andrew. "I've watched this man spend 6 months solving a dispute that everyone else wanted to settle in 6 hours. He prepares. He listens. He documents. And when the time comes to act, he rarely needs to argue." Several executives applauded again. Charles stepped aside. "Andrew, the floor is yours." Andrew approached the podium. The applause gradually faded. He adjusted the microphone slightly lower. His voice remained calm. "Good morning." No dramatic opening. No motivational quotation. No performance. "Most of the work behind this project was completed long before today." He glanced briefly toward the acquisition map. "My responsibility was simple. Make certain every agreement respected every owner. No shortcuts. No unnecessary pressure. No promises we couldn't keep." He paused. "The result is what you see behind me." One reporter whispered to another, "He doesn't sound like a consultant." "No, he sounds like the person actually running the project," Andrew continued. "Success in acquisitions isn't measured by how quickly land changes hands. It's measured by how few problems remain after closing." Another pause. "The public usually notices buildings. My work ends before the foundations begin." Several audience members smiled. It perfectly explained why so few people knew his name. He had always operated before cameras arrived. Andrew stepped away from the podium. He had spoken for less than 3 minutes. Yet somehow the room felt more attentive than before. Charles returned. "Thank you, Andrew." He looked toward the front row. "I'd now like to invite Mr. Victor Sterling to join us for the execution of the development agreement." Victor finally stood. He adjusted his jacket while forcing a composed expression. As he walked toward the stage, he glanced once toward Andrew. Andrew acknowledged him with a polite nod. Nothing more. Victor climbed the steps. Charles completed the introductions. "Victor Sterling. Andrew Jackson." The two men shook hands again. This time Victor held on slightly longer. "I've heard quite a bit about you this morning." Andrew answered evenly. "I imagine we both have." Victor smiled. "I wasn't aware how involved you'd been." Andrew met his eyes calmly. "Confidentiality was part of the assignment." Victor nodded. "Understandable?" Yet something about the exchange unsettled him. Andrew displayed none of the behavior Victor expected from someone receiving public recognition. No excitement, no nervousness, no attempt to impress, only quiet professionalism. The signing table had already been prepared. 3 leather binders rested side by side. Charles sat first. Victor sat opposite him. Andrew took the remaining chair. Television cameras moved closer. Photographers surrounded the stage. The chief legal counsel approached with the execution documents. She placed one binder before Victor. Please sign the marked pages. Another before Charles. Then she placed the thickest binder before Andrew. Victor noticed immediately. His own binder contained perhaps 20 tabs. Andrew's contained dozens. The attorney spoke clearly. Mr. Jackson, your authorizations appear first. Victor looked up. First? The attorney nodded. Yes. Granite Peak cannot transfer the assembled holdings until Mr. Jackson executes the assignment documents. Victor blinked. I thought the land was already transferred. Andrew quietly opened the binder. No. Victor turned toward Charles. What does she mean? Charles answered without hesitation. The acquisition companies still belong to Andrew's management structure. Victor stared. I thought they belonged to Granite Peak. They will, Charles replied, in approximately 5 minutes. Silence. The words landed harder than anyone expected. Victor slowly looked back toward Andrew. For the first time since entering the ballroom, he realized something fundamental. The $612 million worth of assembled property did not legally belong to Granite Peak, did not legally belong to Sterling Urban Development. At that exact moment, it remained under Andrew Jackson's control. Mila felt every breath become heavier. 14 years beside this man. She had believed he managed construction schedules. She had believed he answered to supervisors. She had believed success belonged to louder men. Now she watched nearly every powerful executive in the room, waiting for one quiet signature from the husband she had dismissed as ordinary. Andrew uncapped his fountain pen. The ballroom became so silent that the soft click of the pen echoed through the microphones. Every camera focused on the first signature line, and before Andrew lowered the pen to the paper, Victor leaned forward and asked the one question that suddenly mattered more than every speech delivered that morning. Mr. Jackson, exactly how much of this project do you control? Victor Sterling did not immediately answer his own question. Exactly how much of this project do you control? The ballroom remained silent. Hundreds of eyes shifted toward Andrew. The reporters nearest the stage lowered their cameras just enough to hear the response. Andrew looked at Victor for only a moment before answering. I control exactly what my contracts require me to control. Nothing more, nothing less. His voice remained even. There was no trace of arrogance. Victor forced a polite smile. And that would be... Before Andrew could respond, Charles Whitmore leaned toward the microphone. I believe that question deserves a precise answer. He turned toward the audience. Many of you are seeing only the completed project. What you don't see is its legal structure. He nodded toward the chief legal counsel. Margaret Ellis stepped forward carrying a thick binder. She spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to explaining complicated transactions. The Falcon Development District was intentionally assembled through a network of independent acquisition entities. She pointed toward the screen. Each entity purchased land separately. Each followed different closing schedules. Each reported independently. Victor interrupted. Yes, we are aware of that. Margaret acknowledged him politely. What many people don't realize is that every acquisition entity entered into a centralized management agreement. She paused. The managing consultant for every one of those entities, she looked toward Andrew, is Mr. Andrew Jackson. Several executives nodded. Victor remained perfectly still. Margaret continued. Until today's assignment documents are fully executed, the assembled ownership interests remain under those management agreements. She opened the binder. Section 14. No ownership package may be transferred. No financing package may be released. No consolidated deed package may be recorded. Without written authorization from the managing consultant. Another pause. In this case, Mr. Andrew Jackson, The silence deepened. Victor finally understood. The companies purchasing the land had never belonged to his development firm. His company had been building designs, attracting investors, securing permits, and preparing construction schedules. Andrew had quietly built the foundation beneath all of it. Without that foundation, nothing moved. Victor slowly asked, "So, if Andrew doesn't sign?" Margaret answered before anyone else could. "The transfer cannot legally occur," Charles added calmly. "The financing instructions also remain inactive." A representative from First National Commercial Bank nodded. "Our escrow department has identical instructions." Victor looked towards the banker. "You won't release funds." "Not before authorization." "Even with my signature?" The banker shook his head. "No. Our lending committee approved funding contingent upon completion of the acquisition package. The acquisition package requires Mr. Jackson's certification." Victor looked around the stage. Every answer pointed in exactly the same direction. "Andrew?" He turned back toward Andrew. "I had no idea." Andrew replied simply, "I know." Victor studied him carefully. There was no satisfaction in Andrew's face, no hidden smile, no desire to embarrass him, only professionalism. That somehow made the situation worse. If Andrew had been gloating, Victor could have dismissed him as emotional. Instead, he remained completely composed. The audience watched every exchange. Business reporters began whispering among themselves. One quietly typed notes onto a tablet. "Unknown consultant controls closing." Another murmured, "This is bigger than we thought." Meanwhile, Mila struggled to process everything she had heard. Fragments of forgotten conversations returned one after another. One evening, 6 years earlier, she had found Andrew sitting alone in the study surrounded by county maps. She remembered asking, "What are those?" He answered, "Land surveys." She laughed. "For another construction project?" He smiled. "Something like that." She never asked again. Another memory. Andrew once spent an entire Saturday driving across rural counties west of Fort Worth. She complained that he cared more about work than weekends. He apologized. "I have to inspect several properties." She assumed he supervised construction crews. Now she understood. He had been evaluating land acquisitions. One more memory surfaced. A tax document had arrived by certified mail. She glanced at the sender. AJ Strategic Holdings. She asked, "Is this one of your clients?" Andrew answered, "It's related to work." She never opened the envelope, never cared enough to ask again. Standing inside the ballroom, Mila felt those forgotten moments rearrange themselves into an entirely different story. Andrew had never lied. She had simply stopped listening. Charles interrupted her thoughts. "We'll proceed with the execution." Andrew uncapped his fountain pen again. The first signature required nearly 30 seconds, not because he hesitated, because every page required careful verification. Document number, legal description, parcel schedule, signature, initial, date, again, and again. He moved methodically, each motion deliberate. Victor watched closely. The process felt strangely unfamiliar. Despite being CEO of the development company, he realized Andrew understood every page better than anyone else present. Occasionally, Andrew paused, not to think, to confirm. He compared parcel numbers against an index, verified survey references, checked title schedules. Only then did he continue. Charles smiled quietly. "This is why closings stay smooth." Victor couldn't help asking, "You verify everything personally?" Andrew looked up briefly. "I signed responsibility." "So I verify responsibility." Victor leaned back. He had delegated similar work years ago. Andrew apparently never had. After nearly 15 minutes, Andrew closed the first binder. Margaret collected it immediately. She handed it to another attorney who hurried toward a secure room behind the stage. Victor frowned. "What happens now?" Margaret answered. "Those documents activate the assignment sequence. The next stage begins immediately." Several minutes later, another attorney returned carrying a thin envelope. She whispered something into Charles Whitmore's ear. Charles nodded. He looked toward the representative from First National Commercial Bank. "We're clear." The banker checked his tablet. A notification appeared. He smiled. "Escrow restrictions partially lifted." Victor stared. "All ready." The banker nodded. "The system updates in real time." Charles looked toward Andrew. "As always." Andrew simply closed another binder. No celebration. No visible emotion. Just work. Back in the audience, reporters noticed something unusual. Although Victor had been advertised as the project's central figure, nearly every executive leaving the stage paused briefly beside Andrew. Some shook his hand. Others thanked him quietly. Several addressed him by first name. One elderly investor smiled. "Excellent work, Andrew." Another said, "I'll call you about Colorado." A third added, "We've got another acquisition starting next month." Victor noticed every interaction. These weren't introductions. These were long-established professional relationships. How many projects had Andrew completed before this one? How many investors already trusted him? How many companies depended on him without appearing in public? Questions multiplied faster than answers. Near the edge of the ballroom, Rebecca Lawson stood beside Michael Turner. Neither had spoken much during the ceremony. Michael quietly smiled. "I wondered how long it would take." Rebecca looked toward Victor. "To realize," Michael nodded. "He spent 2 years believing he was leading the most important part." Rebecca folded her arms. "The irony is, he probably couldn't have finished it without Andrew." Michael answered calmly. "He couldn't have started it." On stage, Margaret placed one final document before Andrew. "This is the certification of complete acquisition." Andrew reviewed every page. His eyes stopped briefly at one paragraph. He read it twice, then reached for his pen. Victor leaned forward instinctively. One signature. That was all that remained. Andrew lowered the pen toward the paper, then stopped. Not because of doubt, because he had noticed something. A single page near the back of the certification package carried information that had not appeared in the draft he reviewed 48 hours earlier. He looked up slowly. "Margaret." "Yes." "This attachment wasn't in the original execution copy." The room immediately fell silent again. Margaret frowned. "What attachment?" Andrew rotated the binder toward her. She read the page. Her expression changed, very slightly, but enough for Charles Whitmore to notice. He leaned forward. "What is it?" Margaret answered quietly. "This financial disclosure schedule," she looked at Victor, "was amended yesterday." Andrew closed the binder without signing. The room suddenly felt much colder. For nearly 5 full seconds, no one in the ballroom spoke. Margaret Ellis continued staring at the unexpected attachment while Andrew waited with both hands resting calmly on the open binder. He had not accused anyone. He had not raised his voice. He had simply noticed something that did not belong. Charles Whitmore leaned closer. "What changed?" Margaret turned another page. "The financial disclosure schedule was revised yesterday evening." Charles frowned. "Who authorized the revision?" "I don't know." She immediately looked toward another attorney standing behind the stage. "Kevin was legal notified." Kevin quickly opened his tablet. He searched through the firm's document management system. His expression tightened. "I don't see a revision request." Margaret looked back at Andrew. "The execution copy you reviewed 48 hours ago didn't include this page," Andrew answered quietly. "No." "You compared it." "I compare every execution package." Charles gave a slow nod. That answer did not surprise him. It reassured him. Andrew's habit of reviewing every page had prevented problems before. Perhaps it had just prevented another one. Victor shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "What exactly is the issue?" Margaret spoke carefully. "I don't know yet. But we aren't signing another page until we understand why it appeared." Victor forced a polite smile. "Surely it's just an administrative update." Andrew finally looked at him. Administrative updates still require documentation. His tone remained completely professional. No accusation, just procedure. Margaret agreed immediately. "Correct." She turned toward Kevin. "Print the revision history." Kevin hurried away. The audience sensed something had changed. Whispers quietly spread across the ballroom. The reporters immediately recognized the shift. Cameras remained pointed toward the stage. One journalist whispered, "They've stopped the signing." Another answered, "Something's wrong." Across the room, Mila watched Andrew instead of the attorneys. She noticed something she had overlooked throughout their marriage. He never reacted emotionally when pressure increased. He became calmer. Years earlier, she had mistaken that calmness for indifference. Now she realized it came from preparation. Andrew wasn't calm because nothing mattered. He was calm because he had already prepared for problems before they happened. Charles folded his hands. "We'll take a short recess." No documents leave the stage. No additional signatures. Everyone agreed. The principal executives moved toward a smaller conference room behind the ballroom. Only essential personnel followed. Victor walked beside Charles. "I honestly don't understand." Charles answered honestly. "I believe you." Victor looked surprised. "You do? I don't think you knew about this attachment." Victor released a quiet breath. "Thank you." Charles stopped walking. "But that doesn't change the process." Victor nodded. "I understand." Inside the conference room, Margaret connected her laptop to a large monitor. Kevin returned, carrying several printed reports. "I found the audit trail." Margaret immediately examined the first page. "The document was modified yesterday." She looked lower. 8:14 p.m. Charles asked, "By whom?" Kevin hesitated. "The upload came from Sterling Urban Development." The room became silent. Victor frowned. "That doesn't mean I approved it." "No," Margaret agreed. "It only tells us the source." Victor immediately looked toward his chief financial officer. "Were you aware of this?" The CFO shook his head. "No." "What about legal?" Another executive answered. "I've never seen this schedule." Victor rubbed his forehead. "This doesn't make sense." Andrew quietly listened. He never interrupted. Margaret continued reading. The attachment adds a projected financing distribution summary. Charles looked toward Andrew. "Was that part of your acquisition structure?" "No." "Did anyone ask your approval?" "No." Margaret closed the report. "Then it shouldn't be here." The room remained quiet. Charles looked toward Victor. "I'm going to ask you something directly." Victor nodded. "Go ahead." "Has anyone inside your organization been changing execution documents without notifying Granite Peak?" Victor answered immediately. "Not intentionally." Charles watched him for several seconds. He believed him, at least partially. Someone had changed something. Whether Victor knew remained uncertain. Andrew finally spoke. "May I?" Charles nodded. Andrew slid the amended page beside the original draft from his portfolio. He had brought his own reference copy. Every page, every version, every approval. Margaret compared both documents. "The formatting is identical." She turned another page. "So are the legal references." Andrew pointed to one paragraph. "There." Everyone leaned closer. The paragraph appeared almost unchanged. Almost. One sentence had been added. Projected consultant incentive distribution, subject to executive approval. Andrew quietly asked, "Who inserted that language?" Nobody answered. Victor looked confused. "What does it mean?" Margaret answered. "It changes the appearance of compensation authority." Charles narrowed his eyes. "Explain." She looked around the room. "In the approved version, consulting compensation is governed entirely by pre-existing contracts. In this revised version, it suggests executive discretion." Victor still looked puzzled. "So," Andrew answered, "it isn't true." Silence. Andrew continued. "My compensation was finalized nearly 2 years ago. It cannot legally be changed. This wording creates the appearance that today's board could alter existing obligations." Charles understood immediately, which could invalidate several agreements. Margaret nodded. "Potentially." Victor slowly sat back. Someone had nearly introduced language capable of triggering contract disputes worth millions of dollars, without Andrew noticing it. The documents might already have been signed. The realization unsettled everyone. Charles looked toward Andrew. "How did you catch it?" Andrew answered honestly. "The paragraph was 1 line longer." Several people blinked. "That's all," Andrew nodded. "I remembered where the page break should be." Kevin stared in disbelief. "You noticed one additional line." Andrew looked at him. "I review these documents for months. When one page changes, I notice." No one spoke. Charles quietly smiled to himself. This was precisely why Andrew remained indispensable. Not because he was brilliant, because he paid attention when everyone else assumed everything was already correct. Victor slowly looked toward Andrew. "I owe you an apology." Andrew met his eyes. "For what?" "I thought you were delaying the closing." Andrew shook his head. "I'm protecting it." The sentence lingered in the room. Margaret picked up the revised page. "This attachment is removed." Kevin immediately nodded. "I'll prepare corrected execution copies." Charles looked toward the banker. "Any issue delaying escrow 30 minutes?" "No." The banker smiled. "We'd rather wait 30 minutes than litigate for 3 years." Several people quietly laughed. The tension eased, but not completely. Victor remained thoughtful. His confidence had changed. Earlier that morning, he viewed Andrew as another consultant. Now he watched him with entirely different respect. He asked quietly, "How many transactions have you managed?" Andrew considered the question. "I stopped counting after 70. Victor almost laughed. 70, Andrew nodded. "Approximately." "Average value?" "It varies." Charles answered for him. "The last 5 averaged over 400 million. Victor stared. He had spent years building a public reputation through high-profile developments. Meanwhile, the quiet man sitting beside him had quietly coordinated projects of similar scale without appearing in a single magazine. Back in the ballroom, guests continued talking among themselves. Speculation spread rapidly. Nobody knew the details, only that the signing had paused. Mila stood near one of the windows overlooking Commerce Street. She watched Andrew through the glass conference room. He wasn't speaking much. He listened, reviewed papers, answered only when necessary. Exactly the same way he had approached every disagreement during their marriage. She remembered criticizing him countless times. "You never fight." Now she understood. Andrew never wasted energy on arguments. He prepared facts. The facts did the fighting for him. Inside the conference room, Kevin returned, carrying corrected documents. Margaret carefully inspected every page. She compared them against Andrew's original copy. Finally, she nodded. "Everything matches." Charles looked toward Andrew. "One more review." Andrew opened the binder again. Page after page, every paragraph, every exhibit, every schedule. The room waited. No one rushed him. Not anymore. After nearly 12 minutes, Andrew closed the binder. He placed his fountain pen on top, then looked calmly toward Charles. "The documents are accurate." Charles smiled. "So now," he stood, "let's finish what we started." The executives rose together. Outside the conference room, the ballroom lights brightened once more as guests returned to their seats. The signing ceremony was ready to resume, but Victor now understood something he would never forget. The greatest threat to a $600 million transaction had not been market conditions. It had been one unnoticed sentence, and the only person who had seen it was the quiet man everyone had underestimated. When the executives returned to the ballroom, the atmosphere had changed. The earlier excitement had become quiet anticipation. Nobody knew exactly what had happened behind the closed conference room doors. Everyone understood only one thing. The signing had stopped because Andrew Jackson had found something no one else had seen. That alone was enough to reshape the room. People who had barely noticed him that morning now watched every step he took. Andrew walked beside Charles Whitmore without speaking. The corrected leather binders rested beneath his arm. Victor followed a few steps behind. The difference was subtle. Earlier they had walked as though Victor were leading the event. Now he naturally allowed Andrew and Charles to move first. No one announced the change. Everyone saw it. The master of ceremonies stepped back to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. The documentation review has been completed. We will now proceed with the execution of the Falcon Development District Agreement." Applause spread politely through the ballroom. This time it sounded different, more respectful, less ceremonial. Andrew took his seat. Margaret Ellis distributed the corrected documents. Before anyone signed, she addressed the audience. "As legal counsel, I want to recognize the importance of today's review. Our execution package contained an unauthorized amendment. It was identified before signing. It has been removed." She looked briefly toward Andrew. "The transaction proceeds with complete legal integrity." The statement lasted less than 30 seconds, yet it carried enormous weight. Business reporters immediately wrote down every word: unauthorized amendment, identified before signing, legal integrity. Victor glanced toward Andrew. "Thank you." Andrew simply nodded. "There was nothing personal." "I know," Victor answered honestly. "I appreciate that." Charles smiled faintly. "Good. Now let's make history." Andrew opened the binder once more. This time every page matched perfectly. He reviewed them again anyway, not because he doubted Margaret, because it was his responsibility. One by one, the signatures began. Andrew signed first: the legal transfer authorizations, the acquisition assignments, the management releases, the escrow certifications. Every signature activated another stage inside the transaction. Attorneys quietly carried completed sections to waiting staff positioned behind the stage. Electronic confirmations began appearing inside banking systems across Texas. County recording offices received encrypted notifications, escrow instructions activated, title transfers prepared automatically. The machinery of a $600 million acquisition moved because one quiet man continued signing page after page. Victor watched in silence. He had spent years believing major projects depended on bold decisions. Today he learned they depended on careful preparation. When Andrew finally reached the last page, he paused only long enough to confirm the exhibit number. Then he signed. Margaret collected the completed binder. She smiled. "Congratulations." Charles extended his hand toward Andrew. "It's done." Andrew shook it. "Now it is." The audience applauded. This time nearly everyone stood, not because someone instructed them, because they understood what they had witnessed. The applause continued for almost a minute. Andrew acknowledged it with the same small nod he had given before. Nothing about him changed. No triumphant expression, no raised fist, no dramatic speech. He remained exactly the same man who had parked an aging Ford Escape beneath the hotel an hour earlier. That quiet consistency impressed people even more. After the formal signing ended, guests gathered throughout the ballroom for conversations and interviews. Reporters immediately surrounded Victor. "Mr. Sterling, how significant is today's acquisition?" Victor answered professionally. "It represents years of work by many outstanding professionals." Another reporter asked, "We understand an unexpected legal issue delayed the signing." Victor nodded. It did. What happened? Victor could have minimized Andrew's role. He could have protected his own public image. Instead, he answered honestly. "Our acquisition consultant identified an unauthorized document revision. What could have happened if it had been missed?" Victor paused. "I'd rather not speculate. But I'm grateful it wasn't." One reporter asked, "Who found it?" Victor looked directly toward Andrew, who stood quietly speaking with a banker across the room. "Andrew Jackson." The cameras immediately turned. Andrew almost seemed surprised by the attention. A journalist approached him. "Mr. Jackson." Andrew looked up politely. "Yes. Can we ask a few questions?" "For a moment. What exactly is your role?" Andrew considered the wording. "I coordinate acquisitions." Another reporter smiled. "That's a very modest description." Andrew answered, "It's also accurate." Laughter spread softly among the reporters. "What made you notice the amendment?" Andrew answered truthfully. "I read the documents." Someone laughed again. "No, seriously." "I am serious. I compare every version." "That's all?" Another reporter asked, "How long have you been doing this?" 21 years. "Biggest transaction?" Andrew smiled faintly. "I don't usually rank clients." Even his refusal sounded professional. The reporters appreciated that. He refused to exaggerate. He refused to advertise himself. His credibility grew with every answer. Across the ballroom, Mila watched everything unfold. She had never seen Andrew become the center of attention, not because he couldn't, because he never sought it. She remembered dinners where she wished he would speak more, networking events where she wanted him to impress people. Now dozens of executives voluntarily walked toward him, not because he entertained them, because they trusted him. Rebecca Lawson joined Andrew near one of the windows. "I think your quiet life just became considerably louder." Andrew smiled. "It'll settle down." Rebecca laughed. "You really believe that?" "I hope so." Michael Turner approached carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water. He handed one to Andrew. "You earned this." Andrew accepted it. "Thank you." Michael looked toward the reporters. "They're already asking whether you're available for interviews next week." Andrew shook his head. "I've got another closing." Rebecca laughed again. "Of course you do." Charles walked over. "I just received confirmation." "The county recorded the first deed package." Andrew nodded. "Good." "The bank released." "The investors?" "Funded." Charles smiled broadly. "Then Falcon officially exists." For the first time that day, Andrew allowed himself a deeper breath. Not relief. Completion. The work that had occupied nearly 3 years of his life had finally reached the finish line. His phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. A single message from his assistant. "Congratulations. Next client meeting confirmed for Monday." Andrew quietly smiled. Work never stopped. Victor approached slowly. There was no audience around them now. Only Charles standing several feet away. Victor extended his hand once more. "I don't think we've actually met properly." Andrew shook it. "No. My name is Victor Sterling." "I know. I'm Andrew Jackson." Victor smiled awkwardly. "I suppose introductions are overdue." Andrew nodded. They usually happen earlier. Victor laughed quietly. I made several assumptions. I noticed. I shouldn't have, Andrew answered honestly. Most people do. Victor looked directly at him. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Why didn't you ever tell me how much of the acquisition you were managing? Andrew answered without hesitation. You never asked. Victor blinked. It sounded almost too simple. But it was true. Andrew continued. Our meetings were always about development schedules. Your team handled development. My team handled acquisitions. Our responsibilities were separate. Victor slowly nodded. When I saw your Ford Escape this morning. He stopped himself. Andrew finished the sentence. You assumed I wasn't successful? Victor lowered his eyes briefly. Yes. Andrew's expression never changed. The vehicle gets good mileage. Charles quietly smiled from nearby. That answer perfectly summarized, Andrew. No resentment, no lecture, no need to embarrass anyone. Only facts. Victor laughed despite himself. I deserved that. No, Andrew replied. You deserved honesty. Victor looked around the ballroom. I think today has given me plenty of that. Before Andrew could respond, one of Granite Peak's senior directors hurried toward them, carrying a folder marked Confidential. His expression looked unusually serious. Andrew, we've just received something from Harris County. Charles immediately became attentive. What is it? The director handed the sealed folder directly to Andrew. It arrived 5 minutes after the closing. Andrew opened it. His eyes moved quickly across the first page. For the first time that entire day, his calm expression changed, only slightly, but enough for Charles Whitmore to recognize that whatever Andrew had just read was far more serious than the document amendment they had already survived. Charles Whitmore recognized the change in Andrew's expression immediately. It lasted less than a second. Most people would never have noticed it. Charles had worked beside Andrew for more than a decade. He knew exactly how unusual it was. What is it? Andrew did not answer immediately. He finished reading the second page before carefully closing the folder. The recording office found an unreleased filing. Charles frowned. What kind of filing? A lien. Victor's face tightened. A lien against the Falcon property? Andrew shook his head. No. Against one parcel. The tension eased slightly. One parcel out of more than 200 was manageable. Then Andrew continued. It wasn't discovered during title review because it wasn't recorded until this morning. Charles immediately understood. After closing. 7 minutes after closing, Margaret Ellis stepped closer. How is that possible? Andrew handed her the notice. She scanned the first page. It isn't attached to Granite Peak. No, Andrew replied. It was filed against the former acquisition entity. Victor looked confused. I thought every entity was transferred. They were, Andrew answered. But recording offices don't operate simultaneously. The transfer sequence takes time. Margaret nodded slowly. He is correct. There is a recording window. Victor looked from one attorney to another. So someone filed a lien during that window. Margaret looked at the timestamp. 8 minutes after the assignment sequence began. Charles folded his arms. Coincidence, Andrew answered quietly. I don't believe in convenient timing. No accusation, just observation. The room became silent again. Margaret examined the filing. The claimant. She stopped reading. Charles noticed. Who? Margaret looked up. Sterling Urban Development. Victor stared at her. What? She handed him the notice. Victor read every line. His expression changed from confusion to disbelief. This can't be right. The filing claims reimbursement for consulting expenses. I never authorized this. Andrew watched him carefully. Victor's reaction appeared genuine, not defensive, simply shocked. Charles asked one question. "Who inside your company can authorize legal filings?" Victor answered immediately. "Only general counsel." Margaret looked toward him. "Where is your general counsel?" Victor turned. Across the ballroom, Daniel Pierce stood speaking with several investors near the buffet. Victor raised his hand. "Daniel." The attorney looked over. His smile disappeared the moment he noticed everyone's expressions. He walked toward them. "What's happened?" Victor handed him the filing. Daniel frowned while reading. "I've never seen this." Charles asked, "Could someone from your office submit it?" Daniel answered carefully. "My office can." "I didn't." Andrew quietly asked, "Who has filing authority?" Daniel hesitated. "3 senior associates. And they require approval." Victor interrupted. "They're supposed to." Daniel nodded. "Yes." Andrew noticed one detail. Daniel had said supposed to. Not always. Margaret looked toward Daniel. "We need your filing logs." Immediately. Daniel took out his phone. Within minutes, he contacted his office. Several tense conversations followed. Everyone waited. Meanwhile, the celebration outside continued. Guests laughed, champagne glasses clinked, photographs were taken. Very few people realized another legal issue had quietly emerged behind the ballroom. Mila noticed. She watched through the glass conference doors. Again, Andrew remained calm. Again, everyone listened when he spoke. Again, facts guided the conversation. She suddenly remembered another forgotten evening, nearly 4 years earlier. Andrew had arrived home after midnight, carrying several county record books. She had been irritated. "You actually brought work home?" He apologized. "I need to verify recording dates." She laughed. "Surely someone else can do that." Andrew answered quietly. "Not this part." At the time, she rolled her eyes. Now she finally understood why. Back inside the conference room, Daniel received an email. He opened the attachment. His forehead tightened. "I found the submission." Charles asked, "Authorized by whom?" Daniel looked uncomfortable. "It originated from our litigation department." Victor frowned. "Litigation? We don't even have litigation on Falcon." Daniel slowly nodded. "We weren't supposed to." Andrew remained silent. Margaret asked, "Who signed the instruction?" Daniel enlarged the document. His eyes widened. "There isn't a signature. Only an electronic approval code." Charles looked toward Andrew. Andrew quietly asked, "Can approval codes be duplicated?" Daniel answered honestly. "They shouldn't." "Can they?" A longer pause. "Yes." Victor slowly sat down. Someone had used an internal authorization code to file a legal claim against the acquisition entities. Whether intentionally or accidentally remained unknown. Margaret turned another page. "The amount claimed—" She stopped again. Charles sighed. "What now?" $384,000. Victor looked confused. "That's insignificant compared to the project." Andrew answered calmly. "It isn't about the amount." Victor looked at him. "It's about priority," Andrew continued. "If the lien remains recorded, it clouds title. The amount doesn't matter. Construction financing could stall. Insurance carriers could pause coverage. Future lenders could demand clarification. One small filing could delay months of work." Charles nodded. "Exactly." Victor looked genuinely frustrated. "So what do we do?" Andrew opened his portfolio. He removed another folder. No one seemed surprised anymore. The label read, "Contingency Procedures." Victor stared. "You planned for this," Andrew answered. "I planned for possibilities." Inside rested prepared legal templates, emergency release forms, affidavits, county filing instructions, contact lists. Margaret looked impressed. You already drafted emergency responses. Andrew nodded. 2 years ago. Charles quietly smiled. This is Andrew. He prepares for events that never happen. Andrew corrected him. Almost never. Daniel examined the templates. They're ready to file. Andrew nodded. They only require today's dates. Margaret looked toward Victor. We can neutralize the lien before close of business. Victor released the breath he had been holding. How long? If everyone cooperates, Andrew answered. About 90 minutes. Daniel looked at Andrew with open admiration. I've practiced commercial law for 18 years. I've never seen contingency files this complete. Andrew shrugged slightly. I dislike emergencies. Charles laughed softly. That's because you eliminate most of them before they become emergencies. Victor leaned forward. Andrew, can I ask something personal? Andrew nodded. Go ahead. When Mila left, the room became quiet. Victor hesitated. I didn't know. Andrew looked at him calmly. I know. I thought... Victor stopped. Andrew finished the sentence himself. You thought I wasn't ambitious. Victor lowered his eyes. Yes. Andrew smiled gently. A lot of people mistake quiet for ordinary. Nobody spoke, Andrew continued. I've never cared about appearing successful. I've always cared about finishing the work. Charles quietly nodded. That's why people keep hiring you. Not because Andrew promoted himself, because completed projects became his reputation. Daniel interrupted. We've identified the employee. Everyone looked up. The approval code belonged to an associate named Eric Holden. Victor frowned. I don't know him. Daniel continued reading. He resigned 23 minutes ago. The room froze. Resigned? Daniel nodded. Effective immediately. Margaret looked toward Andrew. That's not a coincidence. Andrew agreed. No. Charles folded his arms. Can we locate him? Daniel answered. Security says he already left the building. Victor looked frustrated. Call him. Daniel tried. Straight to voicemail. Again. Voicemail. Andrew quietly considered the timeline. Unauthorized amendment, fraudulent lien, immediate resignation. Pieces began fitting together. Not completely, but enough. He looked toward Charles. This wasn't random. Charles nodded. No. Andrew closed the contingency folder. I think someone expected today's closing to fail. Victor looked confused. But why? Andrew answered quietly. Because delayed transactions create opportunities. Before anyone could ask another question, Margaret's phone rang. She listened for only a few seconds, then looked directly at Andrew. The Harris County clerk just called. Charles immediately asked, what happened? Margaret slowly lowered the phone. They've received another filing. Everyone stared at her. She swallowed once. This one. Mentions your name personally. Andrew Jack Dexon. For the first time that day, the problem was no longer aimed at the project. It was aimed directly at him. Margaret Ellis put the phone on speaker. Harris County Recording Division. A woman's professional voice filled the conference room. This is Linda Chavez. Am I speaking with Miss Margaret Ellis? Yes. You requested immediate notification if any additional filings referenced the Falcon acquisition entities. Correct. We received another electronic submission approximately 4 minutes ago. Margaret looked toward Andrew. You mentioned Mr. Jackson. Yes. The filing specifically identifies Andrew Jackson as the responsible managing consultant. Andrew remained silent. What type of filing is it? Linda answered. It appears to be a complaint requesting temporary restriction on future transfers pending review of alleged fiduciary misconduct. The room became perfectly still. Victor looked shocked. What? Charles narrowed his eyes. Read the filing basis. Linda continued. The complaint alleges the managing consultant personally benefited from undisclosed acquisition arrangements. Victor immediately turned toward Andrew. Andrew's expression never changed. Charles spoke first. Is the complaint supported by evidence? Linda answered. I can't determine that. I can only confirm the filing. Margaret asked, Has a judge reviewed it? No. It was electronically submitted. So it has not been accepted. Not yet. Margaret thanked her and ended the call. Nobody spoke. Daniel Pierce broke the silence. This is no longer random. No, Andrew agreed. They've shifted the target. Victor looked confused. They're accusing you personally. Andrew nodded. Yes. Charles asked, Does any part of the allegation have merit? Andrew answered without hesitation. No. Can you prove that? Andrew looked at him. I already have. He placed his leather portfolio on the conference table. It had accompanied him everywhere for years. Victor had assumed it contained ordinary project files. Andrew slowly opened it. Inside rested several carefully organized binders. Every divider carried a handwritten label: contracts, escrow, communications, board approvals, county records, expense logs, conflict certifications. Margaret quietly smiled. I should have guessed. Andrew removed one blue binder. Independent compensation. Another. Conflict disclosures. Then another. Professional ethics certifications. Victor watched silently. Andrew laid every binder across the table. I've maintained complete records since the project began. Charles smiled. Longer than that? Andrew nodded. Since my first acquisition. Margaret opened the compensation binder. Every consulting payment appeared in chronological order. Every invoice, every bank confirmation, every tax document, every client authorization, nothing was missing. Daniel opened another binder. Conflict disclosure forms, annual certifications, independent legal opinions, signed acknowledgments. Again, nothing missing. Victor looked stunned. You kept everything, Andrew answered calmly. People forget conversations. They rarely forget documents. Charles quietly laughed. I've heard him say that for years. Andrew continued. I've learned something. The truth survives much longer when it's organized. Margaret examined another section. These aren't copies. They're certified originals. Andrew nodded. I request certified copies whenever possible. Daniel shook his head slowly. I've never seen record-keeping like this. Andrew simply closed another binder. I've been accused before. Victor looked surprised. You have? Not often. But enough. What happened? The documents answered. Andrew never elaborated. He didn't need to. The evidence already sat on the table. Charles looked towards Margaret. If this reaches a judge, Margaret answered immediately. It won't survive. Daniel agreed. The complaint has no chance. Victor frowned. Then why file it? Andrew answered quietly. Delay. Everyone looked at him. They don't need to win. They only need confusion. Charles nodded slowly. A delayed transaction. A delayed stock announcement. A delayed financing release. Victor finally understood. The market. Andrew nodded. If Falcon appears unstable for even 48 hours? Victor finished the thought. Competitors gain leverage. Charles added, investors become nervous. Margaret continued, insurance carriers ask questions. Daniel concluded, lenders request clarification. Andrew folded his hands. Delay has value. The sentence lingered in the room. Victor slowly looked toward Andrew. You already expected this. I expected something. How? Andrew answered. Because the amendment failed. Silence, he continued. When the unauthorized contract language failed? They needed another method. Charles smiled faintly. I wondered whether you'd reached that conclusion. Andrew nodded. The timing fits. Margaret looked toward Daniel. We need immediate opposition. Daniel already had his laptop open. I'm drafting it. Andrew gently stopped him. No. Daniel looked surprised. No? Andrew opened another folder. Already completed legal responses, emergency opposition motions, supporting affidavits, evidence indexes, every document already prepared. Only dates remained blank. Daniel stared. You already drafted responses to accusations that hadn't happened, Andrew answered. I drafted responses to accusations that could happen. Charles couldn't hide his admiration anymore. This, he looked around the room, is why Andrew survives. He never prepares for one outcome. He prepares for 20. Victor slowly shook his head. I thought you were simply careful. Andrew smiled faintly. I am? Extremely. Outside the conference room, reporters had begun noticing the continued delay. Questions spread through the ballroom. Another legal review. Another problem Mila overheard fragments of conversation. Something involving county records. Maybe financing. No. I heard it's another filing. She felt her heartbeat quicken. Whatever happened now, Andrew still looked calm through the conference room glass. That calmness now carried an entirely different meaning. Not passivity, control. Rebecca Lawson quietly entered the conference room carrying a tablet. I think you should see this. She handed it to Charles. An online business publication had already posted an article. Falcon deal temporarily paused after legal review. Victor sighed. It begins. Rebecca nodded. The story is spreading. Charles looked toward Andrew. Your name isn't mentioned. Yet? Andrew nodded. It will be. Rebecca looked at him. You don't seem worried. Andrew answered honestly. Worry doesn't organize evidence. Margaret smiled. I may borrow that line someday. Andrew replied, You're welcome to. Daniel finished reviewing the prepared legal packet. This filing is extraordinary. Charles asked the complaint. No. Daniel looked directly at Andrew. The response. Everyone turned toward him. Daniel continued. It addresses nearly every allegation before it's even made. Victor frowned. How is that possible? Andrew answered simply. Patterns. What? False allegations usually follow familiar patterns. So you predicted them. I prepared for them. Charles quietly laughed. I've stopped asking how Andrew thinks. It's usually several steps ahead. Victor leaned back in his chair. For years, he believed success belonged to the loudest executive in the room. Today, he realized success often belonged to the quietest person with the most complete file cabinet. Margaret's phone rang again. Same county office. She answered immediately. Margaret Ellis. Linda Chavez sounded relieved. I wanted to update you. What happened? The electronic complaint has been rejected. Everyone looked up. Rejected. Yes. The submission lacked mandatory supporting affidavits. Daniel smiled. So it never reached judicial review. Correct. Margaret thanked her. The room relaxed for the first time in nearly an hour. Victor laughed softly. So that's it? Andrew slowly shook his head. No. Victor looked puzzled. No. They've failed twice. The amendment. The complaint. Charles immediately understood. They'll try again. Andrew nodded. Probably. Victor sighed. Who are these people? Andrew answered honestly. I don't know, but whoever planned this... They understood the transaction. Daniel looked thoughtful. Someone with inside knowledge. Margaret nodded. Almost certainly. Andrew quietly collected every binder and returned them to his portfolio. The same worn leather case, the same simple locks. Nothing about it suggested it contained enough documentation to dismantle million-dollar accusations in minutes. Charles looked toward him. "You always carry all of this?" Andrew smiled. "Almost always." Victor laughed. "I'll never underestimate that bag again." Before anyone could respond, one of Granite Peak's technology directors hurried into the room carrying a laptop. He looked directly at Charles. "We traced the electronic filings." Charles stood immediately. "To where?" The director looked toward Andrew first, then toward Victor. Finally, he spoke. "They didn't come from outside." Every person in the room became silent. The director swallowed once. "The source was inside this hotel." The technology director closed the conference room door behind him. His breathing was steady, but his face revealed urgency. Charles Whitmore spoke first. "Explain." The director placed his laptop on the table. "Our cybersecurity team reviewed the metadata from both electronic submissions. The contract amendment. The complaint against Andrew." He enlarged a digital map of the hotel. "The network traffic originated here." Victor leaned closer. "You mean someone inside the hotel uploaded both documents?" "Yes." Daniel Pierce frowned. "Could it have been remote access?" The director shook his head. "No." The device authenticated through the hotel's secured executive Wi-Fi. Margaret asked, "Can you narrow the location?" The director typed several commands. A floor plan appeared. "The signal triangulates to the executive business lounge." Victor looked surprised. "That's only 30 yards from this ballroom." Charles folded his arms. "Who had access?" "The executive guests." "The legal teams?" "Selected corporate staff." Andrew quietly studied the screen. His eyes moved across timestamps instead of locations. Charles noticed. "What are you looking at?" Andrew answered. "The intervals." Everyone looked at him. The amendment? The complaint? The resignation? "The timing isn't random." He pointed to the screen. The amendment appeared while everyone attended the opening reception. "The complaint was submitted while we were inside this conference room." Victor nodded slowly. "So," Andrew looked toward him. "Someone watched our reactions." Silence. "They adapted after every failure." Charles immediately understood. "They're still here." Andrew nodded. "Most likely." Margaret looked around the room instinctively. The realization unsettled everyone. The person attempting to sabotage a $600 million transaction might still be standing outside with the guests. The technology director continued. "We also identified the device." He enlarged another screen. "MacBook Pro." Daniel sighed. "Half this room owns one." The director nodded. "But we also captured one additional detail." He highlighted a network registration. The computer connected using a temporary guest credential. Victor frowned. "So we don't know whose computer?" "We know who requested the credential." Everyone waited. The director looked toward hotel management standing near the doorway. "The credential was issued under the name." He checked again. "Mila Jackson." Silence. Victor slowly turned toward Mila. She stood just outside the conference room entrance. Her face immediately lost color. "What?" "I never requested anything," the technology director answered calmly. "I'm only reading the registration." "It doesn't mean you used it." Mila stepped inside. "I've never even been inside the business lounge." Andrew watched her carefully. She looked frightened, not calculating. Charles asked, "When was the credential issued? the director checked. Yesterday afternoon. Mila shook her head. I wasn't even at the hotel yesterday. Victor looked confused. Can someone register under another person's name? The hotel operations manager answered. Unfortunately. Yes. If someone provides basic identification information. Andrew finally spoke. Mila. She looked at him. Did you receive any unusual emails this week? She thought for several seconds. Actually, yes. What kind? A confirmation message from the hotel. I assumed it was spam. Did you open it? No. I deleted it. Andrew nodded slowly. Charles looked at him. You think someone used her identity? Andrew answered. It would explain the registration. Daniel agreed. And it shifts suspicion toward someone emotionally connected to the case. Victor looked uncomfortable. You mean... Andrew finished the thought. If investigators searched quickly, they'd see Mila's name. The room became quiet again. Margaret sighed. Whoever planned this anticipated how people would react. Andrew nodded. Appearances first. Facts later. Rebecca Lawson entered carrying several printed news articles. You should see this. Charles read the headline. Mystery surrounds Falcon closing another article. Legal questions emerge after major development deal. Andrew's name still wasn't public, but speculation had begun. Rebecca pointed toward the second article. Online comments are already spreading theories. Victor rubbed his forehead. This escalated fast. Andrew remained remarkably calm. That's normal. Victor looked surprised. Normal. For misinformation, it always travels faster. Charles quietly smiled, and documentation catches it later. Andrew nodded. Usually. Daniel suddenly looked toward the technology director. Can we access security cameras? The director answered. We already requested them. The hotel manager added, there are cameras covering every hallway leading to the executive lounge. Victor looked hopeful. Then we'll identify whoever entered. The manager hesitated. Not necessarily. Everyone looked at him. The hallway cameras are functioning. The lounge camera? He stopped. Charles narrowed his eyes. What about it? It went offline. When? The manager swallowed. 42 minutes before today's ceremony. Victor closed his eyes briefly. Of course it did. Andrew asked one simple question. Power failure. The manager shook his head. No. The camera cable was disconnected. Daniel sighed. So this was planned. Andrew quietly considered everything. No emotion. Just sequence. Camera disabled. Temporary credential, false amendment, false complaint, resignation, each event connected. Charles watched him think. What are you seeing? Andrew answered. They expected one outcome. Confusion? Victor asked, and now? They're improvising. Charles nodded. Because you caught every step. Andrew didn't answer. He simply looked toward the ballroom beyond the conference room glass. Hundreds of guests continued talking. Someone out there already knew the plan had failed. The only question remaining was whether that person intended to disappear quietly or try once more. Just then, one of the hotel security supervisors entered carrying a tablet. We found something. Everyone gathered around. The footage displayed the executive hallway. Timestamp: 9:41. M, a man wearing a dark baseball cap, entered the lounge carrying a slim laptop bag. His face remained lowered. 3 minutes later, he exited. Different jacket, different glasses, same bag. Victor frowned. He changed clothes. The security supervisor nodded. He entered one restroom. He exited another. Daniel enlarged the image. No facial identification. Andrew quietly studied the man's posture instead. His walk. The way he carried the bag, the angle of his shoulders. Charles noticed. "You recognize something," Andrew answered softly. "The right shoulder." Everyone looked puzzled. "What about it?" "He favors it." Victor frowned. "So," Andrew kept watching. "He carries weight unevenly." Margaret looked confused. "That's enough to identify someone," Andrew answered. "Sometimes." Rebecca asked, "Have you seen him before?" Andrew remained silent for several seconds, then nodded once. "I think so." Charles immediately leaned forward. "Who?" Andrew looked back at the frozen video. "I'm not certain." "I won't accuse anyone." Victor almost smiled. "Of course you won't." Andrew continued studying the footage, then pointed toward the laptop bag. "Pause." The supervisor enlarged the frame. A small silver logo reflected under the hallway lights. Not a company logo, not a manufacturer. A custom luggage tag. 3 initials. DPH Daniel frowned. "I don't know anyone with those initials." Neither did Victor. Neither did Margaret. Andrew said nothing. Instead, he reached into his portfolio one final time. He removed a thin envelope that had remained unopened all day. Charles looked surprised. "You've been carrying that since this morning?" Andrew nodded. "Yes." "What is it?" Andrew looked at the initials on the screen, then at the envelope in his hand. "They match." Everyone stared. Charles asked quietly, "Andrew?" "Whose initials are those?" Andrew slowly opened the envelope. Inside rested a single business card. He turned it over. 3 embossed letters appeared in silver. DPH Andrew looked at Charles. "I met this man 18 months ago. He tried to buy the Falcon land before Granite Peak ever knew it existed." The room fell completely silent. Fan 14. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Andrew held the business card between 2 fingers. The silver initials reflected beneath the conference room lights. DPH Charles Whitmore looked at the card. "Who is he?" Andrew turned the card over. The name was embossed beneath the initials. Daniel Preston Hale, President, Hale Strategic Holdings. Victor frowned. "I've heard that name." Charles nodded. "So have I." Daniel Pierce searched his memory. "Private investment firm. Mostly distressed commercial properties." Andrew quietly placed the card beside the paused security image. The initials match. The luggage tag appears identical. Margaret looked carefully at both. It certainly could be. Victor asked, "When did you meet him?" Andrew leaned back slightly. 18 months ago. He contacted me after hearing rumors about undeveloped industrial land outside Houston. The Falcon property. Charles listened carefully. "What did he want?" "He wanted information." "What kind?" "Ownership." "Negotiations." "Pricing." Victor frowned. "And I declined." Andrew remembered the meeting with remarkable clarity. A quiet restaurant in Dallas, late afternoon, no assistants, no attorneys, just coffee. Daniel Preston Hale had arrived wearing an expensive navy suit and an expensive watch that seemed intended to speak before he did. Andrew noticed both, ignored both. The conversation lasted less than 20 minutes. Hale smiled often, asked indirect questions, complimented Andrew's reputation, then made a simple offer. "If Granite Peak walks away." "My investors would appreciate an introduction," Andrew answered politely. "I don't represent sellers." Hale pushed a sealed envelope across the table. Andrew never opened it. "I think you misunderstand." Hale smiled. "No. I think I understand perfectly." Andrew quietly slid the envelope back. "Our meeting is over." He stood, paid for his own coffee, walked away. That had been the entire conversation, or so he believed. Back in the present, Charles asked, "Did he contact you again?" "No." "Ever?" "No." Victor looked puzzled. So why keep the business card? Andrew answered. I keep records. Charles smiled. Of course you do, Andrew continued. I also made notes after the meeting. He opened another section inside his portfolio. Small black notebook, every page dated, every meeting logged. He found the correct entry within seconds. March 18th, 18 months earlier. Location, time, participants, conversation summary. Daniel Pierce quietly read over his shoulder. You documented everything. Andrew nodded. I document unusual conversations. Victor looked at the handwritten notes. One sentence stood alone beneath the page. Attempted indirect acquisition through consultant. No further contact recommended. Charles quietly laughed. You warned yourself. Andrew nodded once. I did. Margaret looked thoughtful. If Hale wanted Falcon before, Victor finished the thought. He might still want it. Charles added, especially after property values increased. Rebecca Lawson opened her tablet. I'll check. Within moments, she located market estimates. The completed district is projected to exceed $2 billion in long-term value. Victor slowly exhaled. So, delaying today's closing could create another opportunity. Andrew nodded, especially if investors became uncertain. Charles looked toward the technology director. Can we identify Hale as the man in the hallway? The director answered honestly. Not yet. The image isn't clear enough. Andrew quietly considered the timeline. Something still bothered him. Charles noticed. What? Andrew pointed toward the resignation. Eric Holden. Daniel nodded. The associate. He resigned. Andrew continued. But resigning only makes sense if someone expected investigators to stop looking. Victor frowned. You think Eric wasn't acting alone? Andrew answered. I don't think he organized this. Margaret agreed. The legal filings required planning. The technical intrusion required planning. The camera required planning. Daniel added. Someone coordinated everything. Andrew looked again at the paused hallway image. The organizer doesn't expose himself. He hires people. Victor slowly nodded. Like Eric. Andrew said nothing. His silence itself sounded like agreement. Just then, the conference room door opened. Hotel security returned. This just came from valet. Everyone turned. The supervisor held a parking receipt. One guest left the hotel approximately 20 minutes ago. Charles asked, who? We don't know. The reservation used temporary credentials. Andrew asked one question. What vehicle? The supervisor looked down. Black Mercedes S-Class. Victor shook his head. There are dozens here. The supervisor continued. The driver paid cash? Andrew asked again. License plate? The supervisor smiled slightly. We have that. He handed the receipt to Margaret. She immediately passed it to Charles. Charles read the numbers, then stopped. Andrew noticed. You recognize it? Charles nodded. I do. Victor asked, whose is it? Charles looked toward Andrew. Hale Strategic Holdings. The room became completely silent. Victor almost laughed from disbelief. He was actually here. Andrew quietly replied, It appears so. Daniel immediately took out his phone. I'll contact state investigators. Andrew gently raised one hand. Wait, Daniel stopped. Why? Andrew looked toward the window overlooking the parking entrance. If Hale already left, calling now changes nothing. Charles understood. You want evidence first? Andrew nodded. Always. Margaret smiled. I expected that answer. Rebecca suddenly interrupted. The reporters. Everyone looks toward her. They've found out. What? They're asking why Daniel Preston Hale attended today's event. Victor stared. He wasn't invited. Rebecca turned the tablet around. One photograph had already appeared online, taken outside the hotel earlier that morning. The image showed dozens of arriving guests. Near the entrance, partially hidden behind another executive, stood a man in a navy suit. His face was clearer than the hallway footage. Charles looked closely. It's him. Andrew compared the photograph to the business card. Same jawline, same posture, same silver tie clip, same watch. Victor slowly shook his head. He actually came. He watched everything. Andrew nodded. Probably. Rebecca scrolled lower. Another image appeared, taken only minutes later. The same man stood speaking with someone. The face beside him was immediately recognizable. Eric Holden. Daniel looked stunned. So they knew each other? Margaret answered quietly. Apparently. Victor leaned back. The entire thing finally makes sense. Andrew remained thoughtful. No. Victor looked confused. What do you mean? Only part of it. Charles asked, What are we still missing? Andrew answered. The objective. Victor frowned. He wanted Falcon. Yes, but delaying today's closing wasn't enough. Andrew looked around the room. He specifically targeted me. Silence. Charles slowly understood. He wanted to remove the only person who could stop him. Andrew nodded. If I became the investigation, Jenna, nobody would notice the transaction. Margaret quietly closed her folder. Classic diversion? Daniel agreed. And almost successful. Victor looked directly at Andrew. I owe you more than an apology. Andrew shook his head. No. You owe yourself better judgment next time. Victor smiled faintly. Fair enough. Hotel security suddenly received another radio call. The supervisor listened carefully. His expression changed. What happened? Charles asked. The supervisor lowered the radio. Our officers just stopped a courier attempting to leave the loading dock. Everyone looked up. He was carrying a sealed document case. Victor frowned. So, the supervisor swallowed. The delivery label is addressed to Daniel Preston Hale. Andrew quietly closed his portfolio. For the first time all afternoon, he stood before anyone else did. Charles looked at him. What are you thinking? Andrew picked up the business card and slipped it back into his notebook. If Hale sent someone back, he didn't leave empty-handed. Charles nodded once. And if we're fortunate. Andrew finished the sentence. That briefcase contains the one mistake he couldn't prepare for. Andrew Jackson followed the hotel security supervisor through the service corridor without rushing. Charles Whitmore, Margaret Ellis, Victor Sterling. Daniel Pierce and 2 hotel security officers walked behind him. No one spoke. The loading dock sat on the opposite side of the hotel, hidden from the ballroom and the reporters. A white commercial delivery van stood beside the exit. Its rear doors remained open. A young courier stood nearby, looking increasingly nervous. He wore a plain gray uniform. Nothing about him suggested corporate espionage. He looked more confused than frightened. The security supervisor approached first. This is him. The courier immediately raised both hands. I didn't do anything. I was told to deliver the case. Andrew stepped forward. Who hired you? I don't know. I work for Metro Express. They gave me a pickup address. Where? A temporary office downtown. Victor asked, Who handed you the briefcase? A man in a navy suit. Andrew quietly exchanged a glance with Charles. No names were necessary. The courier continued. He told me to bring it here exactly 1 hour after the ceremony started. Margaret asked, Did he say why? No. He just said someone would understand. The security supervisor carefully placed the aluminum briefcase on a nearby inspection table. The courier stepped back. I never opened it. Andrew believed him. His breathing was steady. His answers came naturally. Charles asked, locked. The supervisor nodded. Combination. Andrew looked at the shipping label. Recipient Daniel Preston Hale. Not Granite Peak, not Falcon Development, not Andrew. Daniel Preston Hale. Victor frowned. Why send a package to himself? Andrew quietly answered. Because he never expected it to be intercepted. Margaret looked toward the security officers. Witnesses present? Both officers nodded. She documented the time, the location, every person standing nearby. Andrew watched carefully. Evidence always mattered most before opening anything. Daniel Pierce examined the exterior. No signs of tampering. Andrew pointed toward the handle. Wait. Everyone stopped. A tiny adhesive security strip crossed the latch, unbroken. Andrew smiled faintly. Good, Charles noticed. What? If Hale expected someone else to receive it, he'd want proof it remained unopened. Margaret nodded. Which means, whatever is inside wasn't intended for public eyes. Daniel photographed every angle. Only then did the security supervisor carefully cut the security strip. The combination lock remained. The courier spoke quietly. The code was written on the delivery envelope. He handed over the paperwork. 4 numbers. The supervisor entered them. Click. The locks released. Nobody reached inside immediately. Andrew simply looked. Neatly organized folders. A laptop. Several encrypted USB drives. 2 disposable cell phones. And 1 handwritten notebook. Charles quietly exhaled. This isn't correspondence. No, Andrew answered. It's an operating file. Daniel carefully removed the notebook using gloves. He opened the first page. Every conversation stopped. The handwriting listed names, companies, dates, payments, bribes, corporate targets, property acquisitions, political donations, consulting fees, fake legal filings, everything. Victor stared silently. Margaret slowly turned another page, then another. This, she looked at Andrew, isn't just Falcon. Andrew nodded. No. Daniel continued reading. Houston. Dallas. Phoenix. Atlanta. Dozens of commercial projects. Every entry documented similar tactics. Delay transactions. Create uncertainty. Purchase distressed assets at reduced value. Charles looked toward Victor. Falcon wasn't unique. Victor slowly realized the truth. It was a business model. Andrew nodded once. Exactly. The notebook continued. Page after page. Every operation followed nearly the same pattern. Anonymous filings, fake litigation, inside contacts, media leaks, artificial delays, lower purchase prices, profits. Then Daniel suddenly stopped turning pages. He looked directly at Andrew. There's another list. What list? People who refused to cooperate. Andrew already knew. His own name appeared first. Beside it, someone had written, "Will not negotiate. Keeps complete documentation. Avoid direct contact." Victor quietly laughed in disbelief. They actually studied you. Andrew smiled gently. I suspected they had. Charles looked over Daniel's shoulder. Another note appeared underneath. Neutralize credibility before acquisition closes. Silence settled across the loading dock. Mila had quietly arrived behind the group several minutes earlier. She read the sentence. Her eyes filled with tears. For months she believed Andrew had simply been ordinary. Now she understood something she had never noticed during their marriage. Quiet people often fight battles no one else ever sees. Andrew had never spoken about protecting billion-dollar transactions. He had never mentioned preparing legal contingencies years in advance. He had never complained about carrying records everywhere. He simply did the work, every day, without applause, without recognition. Victor slowly turned toward him. I'm sorry. Andrew looked at him. For what? For judging the surface. Andrew smiled. We've all done it. Victor shook his head. No. I built an entire opinion of you. Your car. Your clothes. The way you spoke. I confused simplicity with lack of value, Andrew answered quietly. A lot of people do. There was no anger, only truth. Hotel security received another radio transmission. The supervisor listened, then smiled. We found him. Everyone looked up. Daniel Preston Hale. No. Eric Holden. He was attempting to board a flight to Belize. Daniel Pierce immediately contacted federal authorities. Within minutes, warrants began moving through the proper legal channels. No dramatic chase, no shouting, no confrontation, only documentation, evidence, procedure, exactly the way Andrew always believed justice should work. Charles looked at the notebook one final time. You realize this changes everything. Andrew nodded. It should. Margaret carefully closed the briefcase. We'll transfer every item through the chain of custody. Andrew approved. Good. No copies. No leaks. Let investigators work. Victor smiled. You really don't enjoy dramatic victories. Andrew looked toward the evening sky beyond the loading dock. They rarely last. The truth usually does. 3 weeks later, federal investigators announced multiple fraud indictments connected to commercial acquisition interference across several states. Daniel Preston Hale surrendered through his attorneys. Eric Holden accepted a plea agreement. Several additional participants faced charges based on documented evidence recovered from the intercepted briefcase. The Falcon Development District moved forward without another legal interruption. Construction cranes filled the skyline before autumn. Thousands of jobs followed. New businesses opened. Families moved into neighborhoods that previously existed only on architectural drawings. Andrew returned to exactly the life he preferred. He drove the same aging Ford Escape. He carried the same worn leather portfolio. He worked in the same modest office. His assistant joked that nothing about him had changed, except the number of clients waiting outside. She wasn't wrong. One quiet Monday morning, Andrew walked into a neighborhood coffee shop before work. He ordered the same black coffee. The cashier smiled. The usual, Andrew nodded. Please. As he waited, someone approached behind him. Mila. She looked different, not because of her clothes, because the certainty she once carried had disappeared. Andrew. He turned politely. Good morning. She hesitated. I've wanted to apologize. Andrew listened. I spent years believing success had to look expensive. I didn't understand you. Andrew answered gently. You understood the version you expected. I'm sorry. I know. She looked at him. Can you ever forgive me? Andrew thought quietly before answering. I forgave you a long time ago. She blinked. You did. Holding anger takes energy. I'd rather spend mine elsewhere. She lowered her eyes. I wish I'd known who you really were. Andrew smiled kindly. You did. I just wasn't trying to impress anyone. He picked up his coffee, wished her a good day, and walked outside. He never looked back. Not because he hated the past, because he no longer lived there. Across the street, the morning sun reflected from the glass tower where Falcon Development now operated. On the entrance directory, one line appeared beneath the company name. Senior Strategic Acquisition Consultant. Andrew Jackson. The title had never mattered much to him. Neither had the office, nor the recognition. Because the most valuable thing he owned had never been money. It had been credibility. A reputation built one document, one decision, and one quiet act of discipline at a time. That reputation survived a divorce. It survived false accusations. It survived sabotage. And in the end, it spoke louder than any argument ever could. Every life eventually reaches a moment when appearances and truth stand side by side. In Andrew's story, Expensive cars, tailored suits, and public attention created an illusion of success, while quiet discipline, integrity, and preparation quietly built the foundation that truly mattered. The people who underestimated him judged what they could see in a few seconds, but character is never measured by a first impression. It is measured by the choices someone makes when no one is watching. Real strength doesn't always speak the loudest. Sometimes it is the person who patiently prepares, carefully documents every step, keeps every promise, and allows facts to speak when emotions fail. In the end, revenge was never Andrew's victory. His victory was protecting his integrity, letting the truth emerge through evidence and walking away without bitterness. That kind of success cannot be taken away by betrayal, gossip, or temporary setbacks. Perhaps you've experienced something similar in your own life. Maybe someone overlooked your value because your success didn't fit their expectations. Maybe you've worked hard in silence while others received the attention. If so, remember, this recognition may come late, but credibility lasts far longer than applause. Stay patient. Keep learning. Keep preparing. One day your consistency will speak louder than anyone else's opinion ever could. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been underestimated only to prove your worth through your actions instead of your words? Share your experience in the comments. I read them all. And if you enjoy stories about resilience, justice, and quiet strength, don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow's story might be the one that reminds you why giving up is never the right ending.